Good morning. It's good to be with you all today again and enjoy this study that we've been doing. You know, we have been going through the Bible and we're studying an outline of the Bible, and obviously there's no way within the time given on a Sunday morning that I'm able to, even if I preach till midnight like Paul the Apostle did, there's no way that I could possibly get through, for instance, the section we're going to be in, the verses that it covers. We're looking at the kingdom of Judah stands alone or continues alone. And this section of the Bible that we're looking at is dealing with after Israel, the 10 tribes, go into captivity. So Judah doesn't go into captivity. And that's going to be the question we're going to look at today. Why Israel and not Judah? The 10 tribes, as we studied last week, were actually formed because God decided to form them, because of how the king of Judah was, or how Solomon had done, and therefore his son Rehoboam had done, following his father's dying and him becoming king. God decided to separate the kingdoms, and so the kingdom, the 10 tribes, had God's blessing going into their own nation. And both of them, we talked about this last week, both of them had been involved at various times, depending on what king they had been involved with idol worship. In fact, Rehoboam, Solomon's son, had made Jeroboam, the other king, even though they had God's sanction for becoming a nation, started out right off the bat wrong, and had 2 golden calves that they worshipped because they weren't able to get to Jerusalem, and so started right into idol worship. And as we studied last week, only one king of Israel, the 10 tribes, really turned out to be a fairly good king, and he was the best of the worst, and he still had his difficulties. Whereas Judah did have some good kings, but he also had some really rotten ones. And quite frankly, today we're going to be studying about a good king. And I'm convinced it's because of that good king that Judah did not go into captivity at the same time that Israel did. In fact, we're going to see something to that case in our scriptures today. But we're also going to see it was because of a bad king that Israel does end up going into captivity. And guess who that bad king was? That bad king was that good king. That good king did very well at the time that the 10 tribes went into captivity. He did one thing wrong. Remember why Moses didn't enter the promised land? Moses didn't enter the promised land because of one sin. I always thought, of course I'm not God, but I always thought, that's rotten. He put up with those Israelites all the way across the wilderness, and he makes one mistake where those Israelites had been complaining the entire time across there. But Moses makes one mistake, and he doesn't enter the promised land. He didn't do what God had told him to do. And all it was talk to a rock. No, he struck the rock. Therefore, he did not go into the promised land. He did not keep God as holy. That's what we come to find out. God did not care for that. And so it was the same thing with this. The king we're going to be looking at is by the way, the best king following David. Quite frankly, from what we can see about this king, he even looked better than Solomon. And Solomon looked very good. Okay? Solomon was the one who prayed for wisdom so that he might be able to lead God's children, God's people, with wisdom. So that's why he asked for wisdom. But at the end of Solomon's life, he went into idol worship. This king did not. This king was death on idol worship. This king is someone that the scripture is going to describe as being a person after God's own heart, followed God the way David did. And so God describes this king, Hezekiah, by the way, is the king. I keep dancing around his name. But Hezekiah, God describes him in the word as probably, now I'm going to take the word probably out. He is the best of the kings of Judah, of the 2 tribes, following the splitting of the nation. So there's what we're going to be looking at. And again, I always like to have in that center column the scripture, the time period that it covers. and that is shown there in 2 Kings chapter 17 through chapter 25 is the time period there. But realize once again, there are some prophets who prophesied during this time. And so we also have some other books of the Old Testament that were written during this time. The whole idea is to get an idea from Scripture of where we're at. And for that matter, why we're there. Okay? We've been studying this idea right here. Okay? The timeline all the way from Adam until after the book of Revelation is written. That's our study, the books of the Bible, and where they fall in. Well, right now we are just before J, that area right there. It's going to go from the time period of around 724 BC until around 586 BC. In genealogy-wise of Jesus Christ, it's going to cover these three men. Perhaps even the fourth one. We're talking about 140 years. Probably should have thrown one of the others in for the genealogy of Christ. But the problem is I know where it ends. I don't know exactly where it starts. And I think I threw that last name before it under the genealogy we looked at last week. So I've got these three right here for this time period. It's pretty close to where we're looking at, the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Even if it is four names. Realize we're only talking about 140 years, around something like that, maybe 150. That Judah stood alone. They were God's chosen people. Now, the 10 tribes of Israel will never come out of their captivity, their dispersion, everything involved with that. And that's where the Samaritans came from. They interbred with the Gentiles, and the Samaritan nation came from. Judah's going to go into captivity. And then they're going to come out of captivity 70 years later. We're going to be studying about that captivity next week, that time period. But be that as it may, they stand alone. They are God's people. And the man who's responsible for that is, well, wait a minute. Before I get there, I forgot. I wanted to remind us. This was the kings of Israel, of the 10 tribes. Okay? Remembering that Judah and Israel are the two names of the nations following the split. And so it's always hard for me to say these are the kings of Israel. David was a king of Israel, but that when they were all the tribes were together. But now that's called Israel, following the Solomon's death, starting with Jeroboam, but working our way all the way down. Notice when it started again. 976 is when Jeroboam started his reign, following Solomon's death. Again, that is an estimate. Where did I? Oh, there it is. That is an estimate. Need my water. That is an estimate for us. But Hoshea, look at the very bottom there. Hoshea is the final king of Israel. And he's the final king of Israel because he was a very evil king. He most certainly, we could look with me if you will, 2 Kings chapter 17. Look at the reason that God allowed the kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes, to go into captivity. 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 21 through 23. 2 Kings 17, 21 through 23. When he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Now this is given a short summary of all the kings of Israel. Very short. They made Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, king. Then Jeroboam drove Israel away from following the Lord and made them commit great sin. As I mentioned, he made those two golden calves for them to worship. The sons of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. They did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel from his sight, as he spoke through all his servants, the prophets. So Israel was carried away into exile from their own land to Assyria until this day. And that, of course, ending with King Hoshea, who once again was a very evil king, who most certainly was involved with the idol worship. Now, notice the date when King Hoshea ended his reign. 721. He was a king for 9 years. Ended his reign in 721. Here's the kings of Judah, the ones following the split. Starting, of course, with Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. But notice the time period Well, there are the good kings. We talked about that, the really good kings who were like David, who were deaf basically on idol worship that was in their nation. Each one of them had their own special thing that they did in following God, and noted them as 4 of the best kings of Judah. Okay, and these other 4 here were pretty good. They still left the worship of idols on the high places, but they did not allow them. They destroyed them in the area around Jerusalem. They were pretty good kings, but they were not as good as those other 5. But here, this is what I wanted to get to. Remember I said, look at the date of when Hoshea's last year of being a king, 721 BC. Look at who was king during that time. Hezekiah. Hezekiah was king of Judah. You can also see how many kings there were during that 150-year period, give or take a year, that Judah still had its own throne before they went into captivity. Those were the kings that were the kings of Judah, the final kings of Judah. Hezekiah, however, as I said, was probably, in fact, you can probably take the probably out of it, was the best king of Judah, following David. The best king of Judah following David. And so with that idea, look at 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 1 through 6 with me. I want you to see how God describes Hezekiah. And we're going to be looking at a few of these verses as we study the good points about Hezekiah. Now it came about in the 3rd year of Hoshea. Hoshea was the king of Israel, the last king of Israel. The 3rd year of Hoshea, the son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, became king. Now Ahaz was another evil king. All right, just a reminder. He was one who was most certainly went after idol worship. But his son Hezekiah became king. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah. He did right in the sight of the Lord, according to all his father David had done. Look at that. There's the compliment that's given to kings in Judah when they were noted as being a good king, like their father David had done. He removed the high places and broke down the sacred pillars and cut down the Asherah. He also broke into pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until those days, the sons of Israel burned incense to it. Remember that serpent that Moses made when the people had been bitten by snakes in the wilderness because of their sin? God had them look upon that serpent that Moses had made, and those who looked on it were not going to die from the snake bites. Remember that? Well, that thing had lasted up until this time, and they were worshiping it. They were worshiping it in Judah, no doubt under all the way up until under his father's reign. Well, not under Hezekiah's reign. Hezekiah tore it down, broke it up. You're not going to be worshiping false gods when I'm king. Okay? So he broke it into pieces. For until those days they had been worshiping it and called it Neshuatan. He trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that after him there was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor among those who were before him. Here's why I can confidently say he was the best king of Judah. Okay, during that time period. David, of course, was one over all 12, but he was the best king of Judah. For he clung to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept his commandments, which the Lord had commanded Moses. Now let's note that. Why did Israel, the 10 tribes, go into captivity? But Judah did not. As I mentioned, they had been worshiping idols in Judah, including the serpent that Moses had made. So why didn't they go in? I am convinced it's because of King Hezekiah. What we see about him and how he led his people, how he brought them back to God. Because note what we saw just now in this reading. Hezekiah did the right in the sight of the Lord. False religion was not tolerated by Hezekiah. Remember what the first 2 commandments of the 10 commandments are? The Jews, of course, were still living under that all the way up until Jesus Christ died on the cross. Those 10 commandments were still in effect. Well, the first 2 are not make an image and don't worship it. Okay? So you're not supposed to worship false gods. I am the Lord your God. In fact, God makes it clear, my name is jealous. He is jealous for his people. Jealous is not always a bad word. Jealousy is what God had for his people and wanted them to follow him. Well, Hezekiah was deaf on false gods. He did not allow it to go on as he was king of Israel. He put a stop to it, even though his father condoned it and was involved in it. Hezekiah put a stop to it. He used his God-given power. He was king. Remember, we also studied about what it meant to have a king, what Israel was told about having a king. Basically, that king was going to be able to do with Israel and its property and its people whatever he wanted to do. That's what it means to have a king. We have a king, Jesus Christ. That's what it means to have a king. He is over us, over everything we own, everything that's involved with us. He has a right to it. Well, see, there's a good thing about being king. When Judah had a good king like Hezekiah, Hezekiah made it clear we are not going to worship idols. In fact, I'm going to destroy those idols. Do you think that was very politically correct in his day, by the way? Especially with those who loved worshiping idols and maybe those who were priests over those idols. When the king came in and he destroyed the very idols they were worshiping. What could they do about it, though? Not a thing, unless they wanted to try to assassinate the king, which would have been going against God, of course. But Hezekiah wasn't going to have anything of it. He had the power to put a stop to it, and so he put a stop to it. See, that's what godly people do. Everything within their power. Paul says this about how we're supposed to treat others around us. He says, as far as it is with you, live at peace with all men. We got power. We got power to cause dissension. We have power to help peace along. See, Christians have power as well. So we need to learn something from Hezekiah. What do we do with our power that God has given us to do? We may not be kings of anywhere. We may not be able to tell people how they're supposed to live or what they're not going to be doing. But we certainly have control of our own selves, don't we? And so Christians having power of God need to do like Hezekiah did, having power as a king. Putting a stop to the evil that was going on in his land. He was not going to allow them to worship idols. That's in verses 3 and 4 of what we just read. Secondly, Hezekiah trusted in the Lord. Look at verse 5 again. He trusted in the Lord. What does that mean to trust in the Lord? Well, what it means is what God says goes. What God promises, believe. What God wants you to do, do. Remember what Jesus said in John chapter 14, verses 1 and 2? He had just told his disciples, they finally got it through their thick heads, that he was going to be going away, that he was going to be leaving them. And then in verses 1 and 2 of John chapter 14, he says, do not let your hearts be troubled. What were they troubled about? Well, Jesus had been their teacher for 3.5 years. Jesus had been the one who, when anyone confronted them, Jesus was the one who stood up and told them this is what God's word says and put a stop to it. No one was able to reach those disciples because of Jesus Christ. Now he's going away. What did they have to be troubled about? Well, now they don't have that buffer anymore, do they? Now they are going to be facing the Sanhedrin. Now they are going to be answering questions on their own. Now they are going to be doing the things that Jesus had been doing to the best of their ability. But they weren't the Son of God. So I can see a little bit about why they might be troubled. Can you? After all that, there's only 12 of them against the whole world that he's going to be sending them out to teach the gospel. 12 against the whole world. Judas, of course, was going to fall away. Had fallen away. There's going to be another who's going to take his place. So at this point, I guess you would say there was 11 of them against the whole world. So Jesus says this, do not let your heart be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. Some of your translations may say believe in God. Some of the newer translations have the word trust. That's because that's what that word believe means. You trust God. Jesus Christ is saying, I'm not leaving you. I'm not leaving you hopeless. He's going to say later on, he's going to be sending a comforter to them that's going to help them with the things they need to learn. But Jesus Christ was not leaving them alone. He was not abandoning them totally. He was going to be gone, but they were going to be working, and God was going to be with them. But his words, it's what I want us to note. Trust me. Trust the Father. We know what we are doing. We know where we are leading you. We know what you have the ability to do. We know what power we're going to give you to help you do what you have the ability to do. We know that you are going to turn the world upside down if you will just trust us. This is what Hezekiah did. Again, as I said a few moments ago, his decrees probably weren't politically correct in his day. Probably made a whole lot of people mad at him. The blessing is he doesn't have to be elected. He's king. He doesn't have to run for the re-election in 4 years. He can do what he wants to do. And they have to follow it, grumbling and everything along, but they have to do it. And the way he was able to do it, even though he knew with many he was not popular, was he trusted God. You know, in our lives, we are going to be doing things. We are going to need to do things because of what God's word says. We're going to need to make decisions that are not going to be popular with other people around us, with friends, with co-workers, bosses, whatever the situation is. We are going to run into difficulties. And the question is going to be whether or not we trust God. That's really where it comes down to, isn't it? Do you trust God, Albert? Do you trust God? Fill in the name with your name. When those things occur, when it gets difficult, when it gets tight, when it gets nasty, when it gets mean, do you trust God? You know the best time to make a decision about what you're going to do when that time comes up? You know when the best time to make that decision is? Now. When it's not happening. You know what the temptation to do when you're going to make the decision at the time it's happening. You know what the temptation is there when that's when you're going to make the decision. So why wait until when that happens, when it gets tough, when it's really difficult? Why wait until then to make the decision about what you're going to do? What are you going to do when it happens? Decide now. I'm going to stand for God. That's my decision. Well, you don't know how rough it's going to get, Albert. I don't care how rough it's going to get. I'm going to stand for God. When you make the decision right now, there's one less thing you got to do when the time comes, isn't it? There's no question, isn't it? I oftentimes tell people, you know why I'm at church services this morning? Yeah, Albert, you're the preacher. We're not going to pay if you're not here. I know exactly why you're here. No. If I wasn't the preacher, I would be here this morning. I'm here this morning because on April 22nd, 1973, I decided I was going to be here this morning. That's the day I made my commitment to God, to follow Him. And that day, I decided I was going to be here this morning. Oh, come out. You didn't even know what the date was for today. And went back in 1973. What the date? You don't understand what I'm saying. That's when everyone should be deciding they're going to be worshiping God on the first day of the week. On the day that they became Christians. He or she became Christians. That's the time you decided you were going to be here, I hope. So when any temptation came up, when anything was going on that I might say, it'd be kind of nice to go do that or do this or be there or be there, be where, you're going to be saying, but I've already decided where I'm going to be on Sunday morning, June 21st, 2020. I decided that way back when. Then there's no question, is there? See, there's one of the problems people sometimes make when they're deciding, I don't know if I'm going to go to church this morning. Well, there's your first mistake. You should have made that decision a long time ago. You did supposedly make that decision a long time ago. There's always things that keep us from coming to church. And then there's also excuses we can make for not going to church, for deciding whether we're going to be. And that's one small thing, whether or not you're at church. Every single point of our lives, the decision needs to be made. I'm going to be doing what God would have me to do at that very second. That's why Hezekiah was successful. Hezekiah trusted the Lord. Hezekiah clung to the Lord. I love that way that's worded. Look at verse 6 of chapter 18. My translation, at least. Does yours read something like this? For, the word for, remember what that's there. Why is it there? Because of what he just said in verse 5. He trusted the Lord, so that there was no other king of Judah like him, before him or after him. For, here's why he trusted the Lord. He clung to him. I love that word. Does that sound familiar, by the way? I need to check and see if this is the same Hebrew word. I didn't do that. But it's the same idea as what was said in Genesis chapter 2. A man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Is that any coincidence that God always looks at the relationship with his people as a marriage? Is that a coincidence? I think not. When you cling to your spouse, it doesn't matter what goes on between you and your spouse. It doesn't matter what troubles that you and your spouse are having. When you cling to your spouse, that is all that. There's that decision again. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to do the godly thing to do when you cling to your spouse in your marriage. What's going to be done is the godly thing. The times we don't do the godly thing is when we're not clinging. We are living for ourselves, clinging to ourselves, clinging to our own desires, as opposed to clinging to our spouse. The same thing with God. How can you possibly deny God when you're holding on to him, clinging him? One of the things I tell couples when I'm doing premarital counseling is, this is what I want you to do. Decide right now to do this. Every time you have an argument, you can't argue unless you're holding hands. Can you imagine how hard it would be to hold hands with someone you're arguing with? Holding hands is a very affectionate position to be in. Now, I guess you could hold that person's hand, arguing with them. Get them down on their knees. I guess you could do that. That wasn't the point I was talking about. I'm talking about being a very affectionate position, and then try to argue. I couldn't argue like that, Albert. Yeah. Hezekiah was a good king because he clung to God. He trusted God even when he was at his lowest. In 2 Corinthians 19 through 4, chapter 19, 14 through 19, I'm not going to read those verses. Look at those verses sometime. In those verses, King Hezekiah had just been told by the king of Assyria, the one who was going to be taking the northern 10, his brethren, into captivity. He was obviously a very strong king. He was telling King Hezekiah, the king of Assyria was, you know what? I've defeated a lot of kingdoms. Their gods couldn't stop me. I'm going to come in and I'm going to take you. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord. And then, let me do that. I want to read the last thing he says there. Go to chapter 19. Chapter 19, 14 through 19. Is that right? Yeah. 19, 14 through 19. Look at what it says at the very end. Now, O Lord, our God, I pray, deliver us from his hand. Now, I said this in Bible class earlier. We're supposed to pray for our enemies. A lot of times what we want to pray for our enemies is zap them, God. That's what I want you to pray. That's what I want. I'm going to pray for my enemy. Zap them, God. Now, that's not praying for your enemy. And you're doing it for your own purposes. Look at when Hezekiah basically says, defeat him, God. Look at the reason. It wasn't for Hezekiah's sake. Look at what he says here. Let me read that again. Now, O Lord our God, I pray, deliver us from the hand of that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, O Lord, are God. Hezekiah, Sennacherib, if I'm saying his name right, Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. That's why I said king of Assyria earlier. I wasn't certain I could say his name right. But the king of Assyria said, I'm defeating other nations. Their gods didn't stop me. I defeated their gods. Hezekiah was insulted. Hezekiah was, remember David when Goliath was shouting, condemning, telling the Israelites, come fight me, I'll defeat you, our God's better than your God. He was taunting them right and left. And David's problem was, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he speaks against Israel and his God? He was incensed that someone would be speaking that way about God. Hezekiah was the same way. Save us, O Lord, so that the world may know that you are God. Not so that my skin will be saved. Not so I won't go into captivity. Save us because of you. Save us because of your glory. There's the way to pray if you're wanting your enemy zapped. You should be praying for your enemy's soul. But God should not be held in derision. Defeat them, God, because you're God. Because they are obviously not working for you. And they should not be successful. He trusted God at his lowest, and God delivered him, by the way. God delivered him. If you look at it, go to verse 35. It happened that night that the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And then they left. they had all these people die. They were ready to destroy Judah, and they didn't have any men, or very many men left. And so they left. They didn't defeat that God, did they? Later on in his life, at the end of his life, in 2 Kings chapter 20, verses 1 through 11, Hezekiah will be told by God's prophet, by Isaiah, he would be told, you're going to die. God prophesied it, said you're going to die. He was ill at the time. He said, you will not survive this illness. You're going to die. And Hezekiah rolled over in his bed and looked at the wall and prayed to God with tears coming out of his eyes and says, Lord, please deliver me from this. And God ends up doing it. Got 15 more years out of the bargain. If he would have died, he may not have made the mistake he made. Hezekiah made a mistake that brought down Judah. But he lived another 15 years. Because of his pride, Hezekiah's pride, because of the pride of one man, Judah fell. Hezekiah took his pride in his things. The very following of surviving that illness there in chapter 20, starting in verse 12, he showed all of his wealth, the wealth of the temple, of his own. He showed it to the king. Get me where I'm at. I'm not seeing where I'm at here. Here in chapter 20, verses 12. There it is. Verses 12 through 18. For some reason, I couldn't see it without seeing the verses. At that time, the king of Babylon came, and Hezekiah showed him all of his wealth. Basically, he was showing him, look at what all I own. Now, mind you, doesn't this sound a lot like Moses? He struck the rock instead of speaking to it. God said, because you didn't trust in me, because you were doing it with your... Moses said, look at what I and God have to do for you. Basically, it was his pride that got him in trouble. And it's Hezekiah's pride that got him in trouble. God, because of that, his pride, he was punished. And his pride was reaping of the whirlwind. What do I mean by that? In Hosea chapter 8, verse 7. Turn there real quick with me. Hosea chapter 8, verse 7. We read this. For they, this is talking about Israel and Samaria, for they sow the wind and they reap the whirlwind. The standing grain has no heads. It yields no grain. Behold, should it yield, strangers would swallow it up. So Israel was swallowed up when they were destroyed by the Assyrians. But they sowed to the wind and reaped the whirlwind. That's exactly what happened with Hezekiah. Hezekiah, because of his pride, he sowed to the wind. He wanted to show off his stuff. God tells him, I'm going to take your nation away. All of your things are going to go to that nation. Which nation? The one he showed it to. Remember who he showed the stuff to? Babylon. Well, Babylon's going to get your stuff. Several generations later, 6 or 8 kings later, they were going to go into captivity. And it's all Hezekiah's fault. Don't get me wrong. Those kings were doing evil things at the very end. They were doing like Assyria, like Israel was when Assyria destroyed them. They were worshiping false gods, just like many times they did before. God finally had enough. But Hezekiah started it down that road. How do I know that? First off, look at 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 19. After Hezekiah is told, he says, because of this, your stuff is, Judah's going to be taken captivity. Your stuff is going to go off into Babylon. What a statement Hezekiah makes in verse 19. Look at what he says. These words Hezekiah said to Isaiah, the word of the Lord which you have spoken is good. For he thought, is it not so if there will be peace and truth in my days? What's he saying? It's not going to happen in my time. Okay, God, that's fine. What an attitude. He wasn't concerned about the Jews, about the generations, his kingdom. At the very end, he still was like, well, it's going to be good for me, so I guess it's not that bad. If Hezekiah would have just died, but he prayed for a longer life. Be careful what you pray for, because sometimes you'll get it. And sometimes maybe you really didn't need it. So he took comfort in his legacy's pain. In 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 7. I'm not going to read both those verses. In 21, the officials get killed by the king of Babylon. But chapter 25, verse 7 is horrible. The final king of Israel, before he dies, they kill his sons in front of his face and then gouge out his eyes. So the king of Babylon does this. So the last thing he sees is his sons die before he can never see anything ever again. Didn't happen in Hezekiah's day. But Hezekiah started them down that road. We need to be constantly aware of our influence. We truly need to be constantly aware of our influence. Hezekiah was a great king who, when he was leading the people as he should be leading the people, he was leading the people against false teaching. He was someone that God's word said followed God's commandments. And because of that, his people did not go into captivity when the Assyrians did, because he was a great king that followed God, that trusted God. Hezekiah was a prideful king who took stock in what he had and showed it off as if it was him instead of God. And because of that, remember me saying about Hezekiah's dad? When you look at 2 Kings chapter 21, verses 1 through 15, you see Hezekiah's son become king. Guess what he did? He built back up the high places and the altars. And he built up something like the serpent, the brass serpent that his grandfather had been worshiping, and the Israelites. And he took them right back into idol worship. Great king. Didn't teach his son very well, did he? His influence on his own son was lacking. Here's the point. We need to be like Hezekiah. We do. We need to be him like he was when he was affecting the kingdom like a good king will. His influence was great. False religion was not to be stood for. God's commandments were to be followed. We need to be people like that who influence the world for the good around us. Also, we need not to be like Hezekiah at the end, who only cared about himself and didn't care about all the other people of God. who was someone whose son was brought up with very bad principles in a very bad way that went off 180% away from what Hezekiah was doing. Following after idols, not keeping God's commands. We need to be people who are good influences to those who are around us, including our children, but others that are around us. We need to be good influences so that they can learn to follow God. What effect will your legacy have on the kingdom today? How is the way that you're living going to affect God's church? What can people of God believe, understand, do because of what you're doing? Will following your footsteps cause them to be pleasing to God or not displeasing to God? And then what effect will your legacy have on tomorrow? How will your life, the way things you teach, the things you say, the things you do, how will it affect the church in the future? Hopefully not the way it affected the kingdom of Judah with Hezekiah. But how do we know? The only way we can know is by doing the will of God. Is there anyone this morning that needs to become a Christian? You have that opportunity. Believing in Jesus Christ, repenting of your sins, confessing Him, and being baptized for the purpose of your sins being forgiven. That's what the Bible says. The reason is. And that's what we need to be doing. And not just one of those things, all of those things are required for our salvation. And if you have done that, remember the commitment you made on that day. How are you keeping your commitment? How's it going? If you're like many of us, at different times in your Christian walk, it's not going as well as it should be. Isn't it wonderful that you have another breath of life to be able to take care of that and come back to God? If there's any way at all we can help you, let us know as we stand and sing.